The Admech FAQ has dropped, and the core rules of the Codex remain intact, but there's plenty of small FAQs and minor nerfs to some of the weird excessive stuff that wasn't intended within the Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're going over the new Admech FAQ, Games Workshop's fairly standard one that they bring out shortly after the Codex. This is the one where they won't really do any balance pass sort of changes, and it's more for clarifying and clearing up unclear wording in rules, or anything that's obviously broken, redundant, or not functioning anywhere near what was intended. As I'm sure most people are aware by now, the new Adeptus Mechanicus are incredibly strong indeed, ridiculous amounts of shooting, and certainly one of the top tier armies in the game. I guess I wouldn't have been enormously surprised if they had changed a few balance things here, but as usual they've elected not to. If they do shake up anything down the line, it likely won't be for a fair few months yet, where for all we know Admech might be looking tame by the comparison of the newly released codexes. In any case, a bunch of really quite important stuff has changed or was clarified, so let's see what we've got. First up, we have a minor change to the Agrippina Verse of Vengeance, their warlord trait that allows them to shoot when they're dying, much in the same way as the Space Marine chapter Ancient. They've clarified that this does indeed last until your next command phase, much like virtually every other similar ability within the Codex, so there's no real surprises there. Next we have a change to Clandestine Infiltration, the Styges stratagem. This is the Styges 1 to 4 deploy a core infantry unit, and beforehand it was just 1 command point per infantry unit used, and you could use it on literally every unit in your army if you had the command points to. Now again, like quite a lot of other interesting deployment stratagems, it is limited. They now say that you can only use it once or twice if you're in a strike force or onslaught battle, so it is technically a nerf to that if you wanted to play some sort of weird Admech army where you just literally stacked the entire midfield with Vanguard or something, and then perhaps just sat on the objectives all game long. I guess it could potentially lead to some fairly silly lists if you were just absolutely abusing it, but I feel like it perhaps wasn't the most unbalanced thing in the world, as if you wanted to use it on tons of units, you'd have to use tons of CP. Styges certainly wasn't the forge world that everyone seems to be running to for competitive play. In any case, I think for most lists, just using 1 or 2 units would have been fairly optimal anyway, unless you were going really heavy on the strategy, but I guess technically it is a small nerf to Styges. Next up we have one of the most important and necessary changes in the FAQ, the expected nerf to Booster Thrust, the Taraxi stratagem that allowed them to essentially become invincible, jumping on and off the board, where they could essentially jump down, fire away with all of their phosphor torches or something, toast an enemy unit, maybe even do an action if they wanted to instead of shooting, and then at the end of the turn they use this Booster Thrust stratagem to get straight back off the board again so your opponent can never target them. Obviously that was completely broken as it gave you a unit that couldn't ever be targeted by anything, while still being able to do optimal damage all game long. They've changed it so you can't use it on a turn that you've come in from Deep Strike Reserve, which seems like a fairly sensible trade-off to me. It still does potentially mean that you could jump forward on your turn, roast something and then go up into the sky. So to be honest, I think it is still quite a powerful and useful stratagem. You can still have your Taraxi sterilizers get in optimal torching range, provided they've started on the board, and then get them safe by jumping them into the sky that turn. Quite a good change in my opinion, nerfs the stratagem without making it useless. Next we have a change to the Tech Priest Manipulus's rules, where their galvanic field wasn't very carefully worded. It gives you an extra 6-inch range and an extra AP -1, and rules as written it will be allowed to stack multiple times on the same unit. It meant that you could get, say, some Skitarii ranges up to AP -3 if you had a couple of Manipuli. Virtually no rule in Warhammer tends to stack like that, so they have indeed clarified it so you can't use the galvanic field multiple times on the same unit. Makes sense, and the Manipulus is still incredibly strong. Even getting that AP -1 with Vanguard when they do all those auto wounds is really powerful indeed. Next, for Cataphron Servitors, so Cataphron Breachers and Destroyers, they removed a redundant heavy weapon movement special rule. The Heavy Battle Servitor rule used to mean that they could move and fire their heavy weapons in 8th edition without suffering the penalties to moving and shooting. Since they gained the bite keyword and are no longer infantry, in 9th edition that doesn't matter at all anyway. So the Heavy Battle Servitor rule was completely redundant, so it makes sense to FAQ it out of the game. Next up, the Onager Dune Trawler gains the data tether keyword, which it always used to have in the past. It is modelled with a data tether on it, so I didn't really see any reason why it shouldn't still get one in 9th. It isn't really the biggest deal in the world for it, but seemed like a strange omission to me. Next, the Scorpius Dune Rider and Archaeopt Transvector both had clarifications to their transport capacity. Again, this one seemed like a really obvious oversight, and I wouldn't have played it any differently. But basically the Dune Riders say that they can only transport Forge World infantry now. Before it was completely unrestricted, so they could technically transport any Imperial infantry, even really random bulky stuff such as Space Marine Centurions if they wanted to. It's now limited to only transporting 12 Forge World infantry models, which kind of makes sense as that's the same for virtually every single transport in the entire game of 40k. Finally, there's a clarification to Wrath of Mars, which I think was fairly obvious to be honest. Wrath of Mars is the very good Mars stratagem, where you pay 1 or 2 command points for the opportunity to do mortal wounds on 6 to wound when you have a shooting attack. It does state quite clearly on the stratagem that you only get up to 6 mortal wounds out of using it, but apparently it looks like some people were trying to rules lawyer it, so the 6 mortal wounds applied to each model rather than the whole unit. So they've just clarified that it applies to the entire unit and not to just each individual model, which wouldn't have really been any limitation at all. I don't think that anyone was really seriously playing it the other way, so this is probably just to close a potential loophole. It's probably for the best that they do that, and Wrath of Mars still remains an excellent command point investment. Spending 1 command point for anything up to 6 mortal wounds really isn't a bad deal whatsoever. Definitely a big draw to playing Mars as a Forge World. So that's around about it for the Admech FAQ. I'd say perhaps the single most important change was to the booster thrust for the Taraxi. That was really quite clearly a broken interaction that tournament organisers were already ruling against. But the clarification for the Manipulus' galvanic field is also quite important too, and it's nice to fix silly loopholes such as the transport capacity for the Dune Rider and Transvector. For me, there's not really anything too surprising in the FAQ. Aside from the Styges thing, this is all pretty much common sense, I think. It does raise the question though whether or not Admech are going to get any sorts of balance pass applied to them at some stage. Drukhari got a fairly solid nerf to their Raiders, Drazar, Crazy Witch Succubus, and Dark Technomancers, and I really wouldn't be too surprised to see something very similar coming for the Admech at some point. Maybe we'll explore it a little bit more in a later video, but I certainly feel like those Iron Striders could be easily in the crosshairs for a small points bump. Maybe a nerf to the Vanguard stratagem that allows them to wound everything non-vehicle on force. It is just about one of the best stratagems in the whole game. And maybe something to interrupt the Lucius buff stack that they can pull off, where they get their Skitarii Rangers and Vanguard to survive near enough anything, saving on a 2+ and only being able to be wounded on force. I think if there's anything that they're going to target with Admech nerfs, then those 3 seem like a fairly reasonable bet. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Anything here that surprises you at all? Or do you agree that this was stuff that was likely going to get patched? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the 40k related content coming, with new videos pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying a lot and you'd like to help support the video, then I'd just like to mention the Patreon page for the channel, which is down in the video description below. Covering all the 40k content does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry to the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.